Hey guys, Marco here with Rotate and Relax. I even have my little Sphinx hanging out with me. Welcome to not so sunny Los Angeles for another episode of All Things Cirrus. Did you know? So I was talking to my Cirrus TCI friends, and the word on the street is that some of us could use a little refresher on how to do approaches correctly. We're going to break this down, of course, into the two main categories, precision approach and non-precision approach. There's a very specific way Cirrus wants you to do it, and that's for the right reasons, and we'll explain why. Now, when you do an IFR approach, precision or non-precision, most of the times you're going to do it on autopilot, especially when you're in real IMC. But I cannot tell you, and I'm going to sound like a broken record, I cannot tell you enough, and you're going to hear that in every video. It is imperative, it is crucial that you practice this when in VFR conditions by yourself or with a Cirrus TCI or CSIP, that you practice this hand flying it. Remember, I'm going to say this every video, you're only as good as your hand flying skills. When you've been flying long enough, you've been flying all kinds of aircraft, even in Cirrus, someday, somewhere, the autopilot is going to do something you don't want it to do. And that's why it's even more important to really know what you're doing and to do it the correct way when it comes to these IFR approaches. Let's start with the non-precision approach. And if you are rusty on this, make sure you go back to your IFOM and refamiliarize yourself with this. This is very important. You're coming in for, to the initial, you do your procedure turn if you have one, but here's really the big thing right here, right? What we're talking about. 2 nautical miles before to the final approach fix. Make sure you get yourself to 100 knots and 50% flaps. Why? Well, the thing is, on a non-precision approach, you're most likely going to deal with an MDA. The whole point is you don't really know if you're even going to make it to your BDP point, if you even have one, or get to a point where you have any of the runway environment in sight, or whatever it is specific to that particular non-precision approach that clears you or gives you permission legally to descend below your MDA. That's why it's so important to be established at 100 knots and 50% flaps. Why? At this point, you're not so much concerned with getting down as you are concerned with making sure you are in the best possible setup and configuration to what? To go around. You do not want to destabilize yourself at this point. Remember, a lot of times, and this has happened to me, you can see the runway environment, and then just as you're about to celebrate you're going to land, you enter another IMC condition. It will happen to you more than not when you're in IMC. So at this point, the best thing to do is just to stay at 50 flaps. And notice, it does at no point does it tell you to go to 100% flaps. So again, this is the big mistake that we see people make. They come to this decision point, and then all of a sudden they're so concerned with putting 100 flaps in, when that in fact is the absolute worst time to do it, which would destabilize you on your approach in the most critical and sensitive area, which is at low altitude, when you want to be quite the opposite. You want to be as established as can be so you can go around. It all comes back to when things don't go according to plan, and a lot of students, we think, sometimes forget that, even experienced Cirrus pilots. Remember, we fly a lot of these approaches with the autopilot engaged, but when the autopilot fails, things become very hectic. And if you're really an IMC and the weather starts coming in, that MDA becomes very important, and a lot of things are going on now. You don't have a glide slope, you're on the localizer, the autopilot isn't working, and you really have to be ahead of the plane. This is not a good time to get behind the plane, right? Which leads back to another thing. How many of you are actually practicing 50% flap landings or no flap landings? And I promise you, it's probably not a lot. If you're one of my students or you've flown with me, you're probably laughing right now, because you know that every flight I do, I will randomly on approach be like, of course in VFR conditions, I'll be like, hey, you know what, the flaps have failed. It gives you great confidence if you ever were to lose the flaps. And I'm telling you, if you're flying long enough, at some point, that autopilot, those flaps will fail, trust me. let's look at the precision approach. Here's the big takeaway for precision approaches. As we'll talk about in a second, you have that huge resource, which is of course the glide slope. Now notice that the speeds are exactly the same. The only thing that has changed is that you slow yourself to 100 knots and 50% flaps once the glide slope is alive. And we're noticing that a lot of people think that you do slow yourself down to 100 knots and 50% flaps once that glide slope is intercepted. No, guys, it is not intercepted. It is when that glide slope comes alive. Why? Well, when the glide slope comes alive, most of the time you'll be intercepting it from underneath, right? Not above, otherwise you have to slam dunk yourself. That still gives you a few moments, sometimes a good 90 seconds to, even 2 minutes till that glide slope is fully intercepted. So they have you go to 100 knots and 50% flaps once the glide slope becomes alive. Not, I repeat, not when the glide slope is intercepted. If you wait till the glide slope is fully intercepted, at which point you actually start your descent, the autopilot starts, going vertical on you as well, not just horizontal. That means that you're already potentially behind the plane, because now you have to configure yourself, and that is the absolutely worst time to do it, is when you start doing vertical navigation, to have to throw in flaps and start slowing yourself down, because now of course the plane is going to want to speed up. The big advantage you have here of course is that you don't have an MDA, you're not leveling off. When you get to your DA, you're going to disconnect the autopilot or of course go missed. And the missed procedure is, you have a toga button. Make sure you suspend the approach and get into your missed procedure, and we'll talk about that at some other point. And again, the last thing you would want to do at 200 AGL, you're breaking out, is now throwing 100% flaps, which would completely destabilize you. That's why the airlines have so little accidents, because they have such strict rules they have to follow. If they're a couple hundred feet plus minus, or they're considered, hey, we're not stabilized, you got to go around. It's not optional. If you find yourself chasing the glide slope, that means you need to practice on your hand flying skills for the ILS. I've been in IMC conditions with students. Santa Barbara, I remember one student very well, and we're breaking out at like 220. The minimums are literally 200 AGL. And we were about to go missed, and we're breaking out at 220, and he's now trying to put 100 flaps in. That's the absolute last thing you want to do. Why? Why would you destabilize yourself at that point? If you have to go missed, you really put yourself in a bad spot now, because the Cirrus is not, a 22 turbo. You don't want to be going missed with 100% flaps. It can get you in big trouble. The whole point of the 50 flaps is that you're perfectly set up, not to land only, but to go around, which could be much more important than the landing itself if you can't go below minimums, right? You've got to make sure you can do this by hand in case the autopilot fails and in case the flaps fail. I showed up at Water Wings Seaplanes in Alabama for my multi-engine seaplane rating, and after the first few hours of flying on the first day, the instructor was like, yep, you're a Cirrus pilot, I can tell. By far the biggest weakness of all the Cirrus pilots is the hand flying skills, the lack of hand flying skills. Like I always tell you guys, I'm going to sound like a broken record. This is so important that I asked my buddy Colin to say a few words.
Hello everyone, I am here on behalf of Marko to tell you about the importance of knowing how to hand fly your airplane properly. My name is Colin Boone, I'm a Gold Seal flight instructor based in the Phoenix area and also a full-time Gulfstream pilot. And I promise I'm not throwing shade at any of you guys, but a lot of those stories come from ATP students or very similar 141 programs and people that learn in cockpits like this, like Cirrus and Diamond pilots. And all of those stories stem with people not knowing how to properly fly the airplane by themselves without the automation. Even VFR pilots staring at the G1000, looking at the panel, relying on a flight director when they're supposed to be looking outside of the airplane. And I cannot tell you how many pilots have come to me, they haven't done an instrument approach, hand flown down to minimums, practice or for real, in a number of years. And look, you guys, I love Cirruses and Diamonds. They are so advanced, the technology is wonderful, the parachutes, everything. These are incredibly safe airplanes. But when you rely on the automation more than your own hand flying skills, it becomes a crutch, not a useful tool. I get it, you buy this $1 million+ airplane, you want to use and abuse all of the wonderful automation that comes in it, but if you rely on that automation all of the time, it becomes more of a crutch than it does an aid to use in the cockpit, because your hand flying skills diminish very rapidly. All of that fancy automation, the autopilot, flight director, fancy glass cockpit, all of that should be treated as an additional crew member, not your primary means of flying the airplane. Because the most common deficiency I see between IPCs, commercial multi-engine training, and just general instrument training on people that own airplanes with advanced avionics, they are terrible at hand flying the airplane, and if they had the hand flying approach down to minimums, they just couldn't do it. If you're somebody that's flying less than 200 hours a year, you should be trying to hand fly every approach you can to keep your skills sharp. I promise you guys, there's no worse feeling in the world than not knowing what to do and not knowing how to hand fly your airplane in a real life emergency scenario with your friends, family, or loved ones on board. And to solve that, I would do two things. One, you could get a simulator, practice flying from home if you don't fly all that much in real life. The second and more preferred option is for you to hand fly every approach you possibly can in the real airplane. So that way, if one of those scenarios happens to you, the autopilot kicks off. You know what? You're the captain. You're the PIC. You got it. You have confidence. Be that captain. And you know what? Since we're talking about it, here's a third thing. Hand fly the airplane up to cruise every once in a while. Terrific exercise.
When you are really proficient on your hand flying skills, it gives you incredible confidence. And good pilots like to challenge themselves and always stay proficient on their hand flying skills. All right, guys, thank you so much for watching. Thanks to all my TCI friends who helped me put this together. Shout out to you guys. I love you guys. Rock. Please subscribe to the channel. A lot more great content coming. We're just warming up. Follow our Facebook page, of course. And as always, if you like some good rock and roll music mixed in with your aviation stuff, you can follow me on Instagram as well. This is my personal page. Always feel free to reach out to me directly. You can look me up online. There's my email, phone number, message me here, Instagram, Facebook. I'm here to help. I love talking about that stuff. And hey, I keep learning after all these years and hours. Have a good week. See you next week.
50, 27 left, little land, 230, 7 left.